Welcome. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And this morning, we have a very interesting discussion on the rising instability in Africa and the potential link between that and violent extremism. We have a distinguished panel with us here today, Stephen Radel, Emily Estelle, and Daniel Eisinga. And here to moderate our discussion this morning is Ambassador Charles Ray, who's a member of the FPRI Board of Trustees. He's also chair of the FPRI Africa program. He has a distinguished career. He was the U.S. ambassador to Zimbabwe and the Kingdom of Cambodia, and before that, he had a 20-year career in the U.S. military as well. For those of you who are new to us, we always take questions. So about halfway through the program, we'll be taking your questions. Please don't wait till halfway through the program. You can go ahead and start putting those questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Finally, before I turn over the program to Ambassador Ray, I'd like to say thank you to our members and supporters. We're very grateful for your support. For those of you who aren't yet in one of those categories, I'd also like to encourage you to become a member or supporter. These programs are free to you. They are not free to us. So we're always grateful for your support. If you like our brand of in-depth coverage of the events, the important events of the day, and you like that and you want to continue to have a place where you can go to get the story behind the story, do consider supporting us. So without further ado, Ambassador Ray.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you and welcome to our three panelists and all of our audience. You heard President Flynn introduced them, Professor Stephen Radel, who is the Assistant Professor of Geospatial Science at the U.S. Air Force Academy, Ms. Emily Estelle, who's a Research Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and Mr. Daniel Eisinga, who is a Research Fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies, at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. Sorry, I got that wrong. And today they'll be talking about, as you heard, violent extremism and its impact on stability in West Africa. And without further ado, I would like to ask each of them, starting with Mrs. Stell, and then Mr. Eisinga, and to batting cleanup, Professor Radel, to give us about a 4-minute introduction to this topic. Thank you very much. Mrs. Stell.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Ray, and thanks so much to FPRI for having me. So my research focuses on Salafi jihadi groups like Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and their different iterations around the continent. And so that's the perspective I'm coming at this from. The main idea that I want to convey to start off is that Salafi jihadi groups are not the main driver of instability, but they benefit from it. They benefit from negative governance trends and can also contribute to them and exacerbate them, forming a vicious cycle that serves the jihadist group's interests over time. So first, if we're looking at what's happening in Mali and Burkina Faso in the Sahel region, we can see jihadist militant groups really capitalizing on governance problems that are not caused by Mali's recent coups, but come from some of the same drivers at both the local and national levels. So the general way that cycle works is that these armed groups will make themselves basically the only defenders of vulnerable communities, and they'll do this by force. They'll really force communities to accept them and then draw retaliation from other armed groups, from state security forces, and then recruit in the aftermath. And so we've seen versions of this cycle play out in different ways across West Africa. I'd argue that it's getting worse now with the Malian army's kind of current approach and the involvement of the Russian Wagner group and some of the recent attacks that have taken place in Mali. Now, as we look more broadly in the region, one of the big questions right now is how much are these jihadist groups going to expand into the Gulf of Guinea and littoral states in West Africa? Jihadist media has made some threats. There have been more attacks in the border regions. And the big question really is governance. Like I said before, governance factors, how people relate to the state, whether or not there's conflict going on between communities that these armed groups can exploit is really going to determine the extent to which jihadist groups can really get a foothold in new countries. And then finally, just to mention the Lake Chad Basin briefly in these opening remarks, Nigeria also faces a jihadist threat that is not really the primary threat that faces Nigeria. And that's kind of the key point, that jihadist groups are able to function and sometimes expand when there are other security crises going on that overwhelm the state's capabilities. So if we look at Nigeria right now, there are kind of myriad security challenges. And as that's been going on, there's been an expansion in where some of the jihadist groups are active, taking advantage of that situation. And that is what poses a real threat to the Nigerian government, is the sheer number of challenges that they're facing at once. So I'll end with that, just to give a quick overview of that main theme. Really excited to get into the discussion today.
Thank you. Mr. Eisen.
Well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. And I guess I should say my research focuses primarily on civil-military relations, counterinsurgency, and violent extremism. And geographically, a lot of my research has been focused on the Sahel. And I have a background working in democratization processes in the Sahel, and that's where my long-term interests and research lie. So with that kind of context laying the foreground here, I think what I'd like to do is build off of what Emily just shared with us to look at sort of the instability generated by the recent spate of coups. And I think that this spate of coups risks sort of careening West Africa back into general acceptance of military government, or recognition of military government as another viable form of government. And Africa is really the only place where we're seeing this take place presently, other than the coup in Myanmar or about a decade ago in Thailand. We're really not seeing militaries take power in other regions of the world. And in the Sahel, we've seen the Malian and Burkina Faso juntas justify their actions on security grounds. So they justify the taking of power based on the accelerated rate of deterioration that the security situation's experienced. But since the coups, we've only seen the security situation worsen, and that worsening has happened even faster than before. So to provide a bit of context, the Sahel, so at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, every year we track militant Islamist group activity across the continent. We see largely 5 different theaters. The Sahel has been one of those 5, and in 2001, it became the most active theater across the board in the continent. And that's after several years of uninterrupted escalation of violence involving militant Islamist groups there, I think since 2015. We also saw different developments where violence from militant Islamist groups, which originally started in Mali, sort of shifted so that now the majority of violence took place in Burkina Faso, but we're still seeing record levels of violence in both countries. And that's true both in terms of events, but also in terms of fatalities. We're also seeing that I think that there are roughly 1 in 12 Burkina-based citizens that have been displaced by this violence. And so it's not to say that the security situation doesn't warrant concern. I guess the bigger concern is whether or not military juntas are well prepared for tackling this. And we haven't seen that happen. We haven't seen any kind of improvement in the security situation since they've done so. So in Mali, for example, we've seen violence increase by at least 70% in terms of militant Islamist activity. So that's not accounting for the human rights allegations or human rights abuses that allegedly the Malian military has been engaged in. It's only looking at militant Islamist group violence. It's also accounting for only militant Islamist group violence against civilians. In fact, in the first quarter of 2022, militant Islamist violence against civilians is higher in terms of fatalities than in any other calendar year. So just the first quarter of 2022 is already higher than any previous calendar year in terms of militant Islamists killing civilians in Mali. And that's after the junta has been in power since August 2020. We've seen a number of other claims that the junta makes that are just not holding up. It claims that it's committed to a democratic transition of power, that it will return authority over to civilians once again. But just today, it's released a decree that it's extending its mandate for another 2 years, even though the mandate expired last March. And so there's no real interest on the part of the junta to actually return power to civilian authority. And this, of course, has strong implications for what's going to happen to the overall trajectory for Mali and for the region, because militaries are not well suited. They have a terrible track record, actually, of governing. They're not trained to govern. They're not trained in fiscal policy. And when they take on that role, they become distracted by what they're supposed to be doing on the battlefield and confronting these security threats. And so rather than developing a counterinsurgency strategy and doctrine, which looks at a population-centric approach to trying to bring some of the governance that Emily mentioned is lacking in communities, instead these juntas are trying to deal with the internal politicking of running the capital and maintaining power. And it just creates a huge distraction from the actual threats and a diversion of different resources. And so I think that there are direct correlations between the growing instability between the juntas taking power and what was already a security crisis that was rapidly accelerating. And I think I'll leave my opening remarks there, but really pleased to be joining this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Riedel.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Ray, and thank you to FPRI and to the other panelists. I'm looking forward to the discussion and a productive exchange of ideas for sure. Without much in the way of preamble here about my background, I co-lead a research project that investigates political violence in general across West Africa. That obviously includes extremism. And today I'm representing our larger research team, which is made up of both regional and subject matter experts. And I think most relevant for our discussion is that our team works with the OECD, their Sahel and West Africa Club, and we produce an annual report on political security across a 21-country region that includes all of West Africa, much of North Africa, and most of the countries that are traditionally thought of as Sahelian. These reports are available for free online in English and French, and I can provide some information for those who are interested in those reports. But my opening comments, I'll just focus on three key takeaways that I think are important ways to contextualize across this broader region the ideas that the other panelists have mentioned here. The first thing is that we really have a lost decade over the last 10 years in the region. And we can trace this back to the start of the Arab Spring, but since then, various forms of identity-based movements have emerged throughout the region, and many of them have differences in ideologies and goals and ambitions, but what unifies this in a regional and, if you like, a temporal context as well, is that they're challenging states. And we've heard some elements about governance already in these opening comments. These are all movements that are trying to do something different relative to the state. And there's a great deal of alienation and grievance that's driving these particular movements. Unfortunately, these particular movements also increasingly target civilians. So from our reports, data shows that since 2011, politically motivated violence in the region has increased nearly fivefold from the previous decade and has killed a documented 127,000 people. That probably is too low. And attacks against civilians are the most prevalent form of this violence regionally now. In 2021 alone, there were 3,400 such attacks of armed groups, militias, rebels, extremists, directly attacking civilians. And that is a trend that is not diminishing in our analysis. So that's the first point. The last decade has been terrible. The second point is that when we take a regional view, we see the outlines of a very complex socio-political system that transcends the territory of individual states and is made up of literally thousands of extremist groups, rebels, militias, and armed groups of various stripes. If we add into this foreign-based entities, multinational peacekeeping operations, unilateral military interventions to proxy forces, Ms. Estelle mentioned the Wagner Group, for example. We now see mercenary groups operating in the region. We have this very complex and ever-changing network of extremist actors that are challenging each other, but are also cooperating with each other at times. And we see increasing numbers of groups operating in the region over time. In 2020, we tracked nearly 1,200 separate groups in that year alone. And many of the most important ones are those that are operating in multiple countries simultaneously, meaning that there's issues and confronting them in one locale because that may have little to no impact on their survivability overall. The system of violence in the region has grown more complex and more resistant to efforts to disrupt it. The third point is that we see really interesting patterns in our analyses in where violence is happening. Our most recent report, which was just published this February from OECD, we looked very closely at the role of borderland regions to extremism. Borderlands are important both theoretically and empirically, because theoretically that's where state influence and investment, especially in a post-colonial context, has typically been at its lowest. And empirically, what we found is that half of all violence in the entire 21 country region that we study has occurred within 100 kilometers of an international border. For our friends in the United States, that's 60 miles, which is not very far. A third of all the events occur just within 50 kilometers or 30 miles. This means borderlands have a very unique role in hosting and perhaps advancing extremism. It also provides a window into questions about how to begin to reverse this lost decade and how to disrupt these complex systems of violence. If we want to make things better, we might first want to take a very hard look at the borderlands in the region. So that's three things in combination with the other opening comments. I suspect that's a great deal for us all to digest and wrestle with. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you. Thank all three of you. Before we go to the audience, I'd just like to ask a couple of questions. From listening to you, the relationship between instability and violent extremism, it becomes hard to. It's sort of a chicken or egg situation. Which is it violent extremism which has contributed to the instability, or was it the instability that creates the breeding ground for violent extremism? Professor Radel, would you like to take a stab at that first?
Not particularly, because I will, because this is a very complex question. On the surface, it's a very straightforward question, but this really gets to the heart of, I'll call it very sometimes different but interconnected political, economic, cultural processes that lead to the rise of extremism. But here's what we do know empirically, what we know scientifically, is that there are ebbs and flows to episodes of violence. Violence is not a straight line continuum. It doesn't happen at the same levels in the same locations over very long periods of time. Instead, it tends to build, erupt, and then eventually subside. And what we are seeing right now is we are in the high water mark, is my estimation, of a cycle of violence that has spilled into multiple states simultaneously. And eventually it will subside. We don't know the details of when or where, but the conditions that we've talked about or hinted at relative to governance were largely present before this episode of violence. And so we might have some clues about why was the Sahel relatively calm for a decade before it wasn't. And if we take that question seriously, then maybe we have some clues about this chicken and egg problem you alluded to. Let me turn it back over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Would either of our other two panelists like to take a stab at my first provocative question?
I'd be happy to.
Sure.
So I think what I would do, or maybe I'd like to talk a little bit about Burkina Faso, because I think it can be an extractive case in this respect. So for those less familiar with Burkina Faso, in 2014, longtime president and Blaise Compaoré was ousted from power in a popular insurrection. And so Blaise Compaoré had taken power after the assassination of Thomas Sankara in 1987. He then sort of institutionally jiggered away to multi-party democracy, in which he won over and over. For those in political science or with little background in political science theory, you might look up competitive authoritarianism as a regime type. And Burkina Faso under Blaise Compaoré sort of fits the bill for what a competitive authoritarian regime looks like. It's one that has elections on a regular basis. There's some degree of competition between political parties, but generally speaking, the outcomes are more or less known. And so Blaise Compaoré tried to change the constitution for a final time in 2014 by rewriting what presidential term limits would be. He was going to eliminate presidential term limits so that he could run again in 2015 for president. And the population rejected it. People were in the streets in the hundreds of thousands, and they mobilized to force him to resign. And so he left. And this was a big moment of instability. 27 years in power, lots of questions over what would happen in Burkina Faso. And there was an extremely successful political transition, 2014, 2015, in which, by and large, those institutions that had all the trappings of democracy were upheld because that's what the people wanted. And even after a military coup was attempted in part of 2015 to disrupt this transition, people again went to the streets and said, no, this is what we want. We want a transition to democratic civilian rule. And then Burkina Faso experienced its most competitive, freest, fairest elections in 2015, which brought the Compaoré administration into power. And so all of that happened, all of this political instability happened under the sort of pressure cooker of authoritarianism that existed during the Compaoré regime. Yet there was enough space for democratic institutions to start to build. And in the wake of that, you started to see along the borderlands, along the periphery of Burkina Faso, violent extremism also start to grow. And that was largely ignored by the Compaoré administration. This new administration with understandably lots of other concerns, first time coming into power, trying to figure out how to run the country without Compaoré's previous administration in place. And so they largely thought, okay, this is a Malian issue. Sure, it's spilling over the border a little bit, but this isn't a major concern. But it started to metastasize. And as that violent extremist activity started to metastasize in northern Burkina Faso, it became a bigger and bigger issue. It became more and more destabilizing. It became a larger and larger policy concern. But at that point, it was already a little bit too late for the Compaoré administration to address it. And when they tried to, they found that their armed forces were largely unprepared and not structured well to address that kind of threat. In fact, the armed forces had been somewhat underfunded as a large-scale organization. They were set up for traditional warfare as opposed to counterinsurgency. They needed a major overhaul with extremely limited resources, and they weren't able to do it quickly enough to address the evolving threat of violent extremism in northern Burkina Faso. And so violent extremism spread throughout the country. And as it did so, it became more and more destabilizing to the point where, fast forward now to 2022, the military, having been defeated on the battlefield numerous times, embarrassed, a number of different scandals occurred within the Burkina Faso administration over corruption, lack of logistical planning, leaving troops without rations on the battlefront. All of these things happen. And of course, you have disgruntled soldiers. And so they decided to take power. And now you have additional instability. And so I'm not sure that thinking about it as a sort of one begets the other is necessarily the right way as in terms of what we do next or what Burkina Faso should be militating for now. I think instead what Burkina Faso ought to be thinking about is what are the appropriate policies for addressing the threats that we confront today? And is a military junta really the right vehicle for addressing those policy concerns? And I would argue that historically, and even in recent history with the current juntas, there has never been any kind of empirical evidence to suggest that the military is a good vehicle for state building or for governance in places like these borderlands where violent extremism does seem to gain root and metastasize in these ways. And so that's kind of how I think about this problem.
Thank you. Mrs. Stell, would you like to add to that?
I'll take a crack at the chicken and egg question. So the way I tend to see this, I'm also going to avoid saying, which one I think comes first, but I think that it's actually that you can have multiple trends existing and then they come together in moments of opportunity. So the example that comes to mind for me is kind of the start of what we would consider, lots of focus on violent extremism in the Sahel. So going back to 2011, 2012, in Mali and the Tuareg rebellion that then jihadist groups were able to kind of infiltrate and try and overtake. And what's interesting looking at that example is that this was far from the first Tuareg rebellion in Mali. If you go back through history, you have all of these different examples. And so the question is, why this time did it turn out differently in this way? And of course, there are almost too many factors that you could give, but there are a few that I think are particularly influential. If you look across the region, what you also had right beforehand was the fall of Gaddafi in Libya, and then some of the spillover effects from, you know, the kind of loosening of the Libyan arsenal. You've got effects on Tuareg populations that cross borders in that area. And so you have this external push that affected the dynamics inside Mali. You also had kind of the ongoing establishment of the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb network that has always been Algerian, but had been expanding and moving southward in various ways for various organizational reasons. And so those kind of external things that weren't about Mali have overlaid what was a Malian national dynamic and changed its character in some way. So I see it as more of a convergence of kind of the time was right. And that plays out when I look at jihadist insurgencies kind of across Africa and also kind of across the Middle East as well, where you have these kind of small dedicated networks and organizations that are trying to achieve this effect. They are trying to use violence to overthrow government in some way and install their own version, and they almost always fail. But sometimes the conditions change in a way that actually favors them. And that's really the only time that we see, say, Al-Qaeda groups or ISIS groups tend to make a really big splash as far as becoming a bigger insurgency, is because there's been some sort of collapse that met with that opportunity. And so that's how I see it in Mali. And I think that pattern holds in some other cases, though, of course, there's always going to be all of this local variation for, you know, why exactly now and why exactly in this way.
Thank you. Okay, I have lots more questions, but I'm only going to ask one more before we let the audience take a crack at you. And that's, how do you see the U.S. counterterrorism policy, our practices in sub-Saharan Africa impacting this situation? And again, I'll start with Professor Riedel and work across the panel.
Thank you, Ambassador Ray. This is an excellent time for me to say something that I should have said at the beginning, which is that all my comments are mine and mine alone. They don't represent the position of the US government, the Department of Defense, the Air Force, or my home academic institution, which is the Air Force Academy. In my judgment, what we've really seen over the last 3 or 4 years is an abandonment of the region in terms of military strategy and in terms of foreign policy attention by the current government and the previous government. This is, if we wanted a straight line to when that event or when that mobility toward disengagement took place, this is probably the Togo attack. I think that was in 2017 in Niger, that killed several US service members and special forces. And that's put a series of political pressures into place that led to general retreat from the region. But the issue is not just about US foreign policy and US engagement in the region. Other governments have had international interventions on and off again for the last decade. The French in particular have been heavily involved in the region, directly, unilaterally. And I would say just generally, my assessment is that all of these types of military-based efforts to confront the issues in the region are largely band-aids. They tend to lead to a swell of violence when they first
Mrs.
emerge.
Stell? Oh, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Oh, no,
I
yeah, you are. Go ahead. Finish.
Okay. What they tend to do is they tend to lead to a swell of violence when they first deploy. Then they can depress violence for some period of time during the deployment, and as soon as they disengage, conditions can reverse immediately. And so these types of direct military engagements that we've seen in the region from foreign actors and foreign governments do not really have the ability to control the processes that we see. That would be my judgment.
Thank you. Mrs. Stell.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm generally on the same page, and I can explain why. So the counterterrorism policy, and to focus on narrowly on counterterrorism, meaning like targeting of networks and targeting of attack planning cells and senior leadership, has been largely a band-aid, as Dr. Radel said. It's a suppression tactic, and I will take the position that it's not without value. And there are, of course, lots of downsides, particularly when counterterrorism goes wrong and there are mistakes, but it does put pressure on these groups and their senior leadership. So if you look at some of the West African groups, particularly Al-Qaeda in the Sahel and the Islamic State in the Sahel, they have had to adapt because their senior leaders have been under pressure. And there have been changes over the last decade, including, especially over the last couple of years, a de-emphasis from particularly the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb network on conducting the kind of flashier, like high-profile attacks in regional capitals. The question, which is difficult to parse out, is did they lose the capability to do that, or did they decide it wasn't strategically valuable anymore? And as with a lot of these questions, I think it's, the answer is a little bit of both, where I've watched jihadist groups in different theaters adapt to counterterrorism pressure and kind of stay below the radar. I have colleagues who've done some really interesting work on how groups have shifted their approach, changed their name, kind of created this bit of an illusion to operate kind of under that counterterrorism pressure. I will say, though, we're now at a moment where a lot of that counterterrorism pressure that has already been waning is really going to lift in a pretty dramatic way. And so, the French drawdown being the big case, of course, US counterterrorism pressure in West Africa is very much a supporting function for what had been the French-led mission. And what I am concerned about is that without some of that pressure and without something better coming in place, or what was really meant to happen, which was fixing some of the governance issues and the non-military issues that underlie this, if you lift the pressure too quickly, then these groups are going to be operating with even more freedom of movement. So I think we're at a dangerous moment for that reason, because even recognizing all the shortcomings of the existing counterterrorism policy, it's now falling apart without something better in place. And I'd argue, particularly the way the Malian government has approached it, they're actually putting something worse in place for the actual drivers of the instability.
Thank you. Mr. Eisinger.
Thanks. I think I would largely agree with both of the other panelists. I think what I'd like to add is that in addition to what counterterrorism strategy has been pursued in the Sahel being successful, in meaning largely decapitation campaigns, taking out leadership of these different groups, there have been quite a number of successes in that respect, and that pressure has forced evolutions amongst the militant Islamist groups. What's been lacking is a sustained security presence by the regional armed forces in the area. And so we've seen that while there has been significant investment in terms of developing sort of special forces and counterterrorism capacity in that respect for some of the armed forces, it hasn't been followed up with the ability of those armed forces to then provide security and protection for communities that would otherwise be under threat. And that leaves the door open for militant Islamist groups to come back. And so every single time we've seen this sort of, a targeting of leadership, a successful operation, the pressure resulting in some damage to militant Islamist groups, maybe a period of degradation, but then a resurgence. And that just keeps going back and forth, and that will continue until the armed forces are able to provide security to those communities. And that requires a different kind of strategic approach. It requires a global approach, meaning that not only do the security forces have to arrive and engage in some kind of surge or increased pressure on militant Islamist groups to push them out of where they are or to help degrade their capacities, they also have to then reestablish the connection between the government or the state and communities. And that gets at this larger governance question. It gets at trying to serve the interests of citizens. That first and primary interest is protection, it's security. And presently, I don't think that there's really a standout amongst Sahelian governments that's able to provide that. And so that should be, I think, where most investment goes, whether it be the Malian government, the Malian investment, or whether it be its partners, needs to be in understanding how do they sustain that security presence so that they can protect civilians who are under threat, and then start to serve the interests that they have beyond just their basic security needs. And so that requires, I think, a lot of thinking in terms of counterinsurgency strategy that hasn't been present for the regional governments up till this point.
Thank you. Thank you, all three. Before we turn it over to President Flynn for the audience Q&A, I'd like to remind our audience, please put your questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box, so that our moderator can see them. And with that, President Flynn.
Thank you. Thanks for a really interesting discussion. We have a lot of good questions in the question and in the Q&A box, as well as in the chat. One of the first ones I'd like to ask is, if you look across the globe over the last 50 years, are there any counterinsurgency campaigns that you think provide a promising blueprint for how to do this? Why don't, Stephen, let's start with you.
Okay, so I think that the way to approach a question like this is to, at least from my own perspective, is to consider whether or not a counterinsurgency effort is itself going to be the salve for the issues that we're seeing in the region. And I'll just draw on the comments that Dr. Azinga and Ms. Estelle were alluding to, and that is that they can be useful in a certain way in combination with other things, but by themselves, they're not the policy toolkit that you would want to bring to bear to reduce this wave of regional violence. Instead, you need to look at issues that range from how these democracies or how these authoritarian governments in the region are going to function day to day. You have to look at how their military is going to function. You have to look at all sorts of aspects of how the society at large is going to operate, and the state in particular. Counterinsurgency is maybe a scalpel, as we've heard about. You know, you do have the ability to depress the activities of certain groups in certain conditions, but it's not the go-to piece of policy that I think that I would look to for sure. And so in that case, I don't have a specific example of counterinsurgency by itself that would address this issue. But the other piece here is that this is not an issue of just government A or government B or government C. This is a regional-wide phenomenon. This thing has diffused over 10 years from country to country to country. And anything that's going to happen here needs to be regional in scope. It needs to involve partnerships beyond individual governments and beyond individual states. There's no way to solve a regional problem one piece at a time. We either cooperate together or we struggle separately. That would be my judgment.
Daniel or Emily, anything to add to that?
I can go ahead. So one example that I think is actually worth bringing up, because it is actually in the same region, is looking at Mauritania and how it's fared, and Mauritania can be kind of a complicated case for reasons of past negotiations with jihadist groups, which gets us into a whole discussion. But Dr. Anwar Bukhars, who's at Africa Center as well, has done some interesting work on Mauritania and kind of the lower hanging fruit of the military capability buildup that the Mauritanian government has done to kind of have the right vehicles and aircraft to be able to surveil their kind of lightly populated border regions, working with their border populations to build up trust and provide basic services so that the population was not vulnerable to jihadists trying to cross the border. So I think when we talk about counterinsurgency, sometimes, especially coming from the US point of view, we tend to think kind of very big, heavily populated. We've had some big examples that really stand to mind when we think of counterinsurgency. And I think that can sometimes mask the nuances of the particular situations in the Sahel. And so Mauritania, I would say, is a cautious success story in this case, given that it's bordering Mali and deals with some of these same issues, but has actually handled this better than some of the other countries in the region. Daniel, anything to add?
Yes, I'll jump in there to say that Emily's absolutely right, and I think that one of the things that has to be considered is about the Sahel, in addition to it being sort of a vast space that's not very heavily or densely populated, is that we're also dealing with really limited resources, and so those low-hanging fruit become really important. For any regional government, whether that be the Malian government, Burkina Faso government, Nigerian government, to take on a kind of restructuring of their armed forces to be effective, they need to identify what are the key areas that they can advance for sustaining that security presence. So one of them would be mobility. These are not particularly mobile armed forces, and yet they have to cover a huge distance in order to get from place to place among these sparsely populated areas. And so investing in mobility so that they can do that at least as well as militant Islamist groups would be a key part of it. Another aspect would be logistics and maintenance, being able to resupply their forces at the front regularly, routinely, and with some success in these really rugged and remote areas is going to be key. And there's a laundry list of other things, but I think that the key point here is that as Dr. Radel said, counterinsurgency it's more of a scalpel. It's not the end all be all answer. And I think though that what's important to remember is that you have to sustain that security presence in order to get to the rest of the solution. And so for those communities that are really facing violence, for the I think nearly 2 million Burkina Faso that are displaced presently because of violence, being able to establish a security presence and maintain it, and do so within the means of the limited resources of the Burkina Faso government, I think that those are the key questions that have to be answered today, so they can begin to look at how do we start building a state, how do we start to implement a greater degree of government services, how do we build a regional plan beyond that, and so I think that's where things sort of stand.
Thank you. Another question. In the Sahel countries, is there a socioeconomic basis to jihadist violence? And I think you covered a lot of this, but socioeconomic covers a real broad range, everything from good governance to all sorts of things. So take a stab at that. And why don't we start the other direction? Let's start with Emily.
Sure. Yeah. I guess the short answer, if you're taking socioeconomic broadly, is that yes, of course, there are socioeconomic drivers, but I think the risk of this question actually gets after how jihadist groups kind of take advantage of local dynamics to try and spread what they're doing. And so if you read some of the statements in media across the region, one of the real risks is that particular ethnic groups or communities get conflated with jihadist groups. And that's something that I have to be really conscious of when we're talking about this, because that's also a kind of a weapon that different actors can use to make this dynamic worse. And what I think we're seeing is really a combination of kind of longstanding local grievances that are meeting with an opportunity. So, right, some of the people that are involved in these organizations, in fact, the bulk of them are really coming from this area, but there are foreigners coming in. One thing I have to push back against a lot as a jihadism analyst is the idea that this is all kind of like from far away and only from outside and coming into a context. But there is an element of people leaving and going for education elsewhere and returning and introducing different concepts. So it's that mixing of kind of existing local problems with these concepts and human networks that are drawn from outside. that creates this kind of mix, which is tricky because it makes it both a local problem and a regional global problem. You both have to deal with foreign fighters coming in and trainers coming in as well, and the fact that there are actual governance and security crises happening locally. So I'll just say it's both kind of out and in, and that is part of what makes it so difficult, because it hits against that kind of the regional lens and the big global picture.
Thank you. Stephen or Daniel, anything to add to that?
I can jump in. I think what what I'd like to do is add a sort of specific example of how socioeconomic dynamics filter into this conflict. And so one aspect of that is through farmer-herder dynamics. So livelihoods, differences in livelihoods, and what are pretty common conflicts in communities. So you have communities that are largely farming communities, and you have herders that move seasonally with their herds, obviously, and this causes tensions and different kinds of conflict or disputes amongst the communities at play. And so in the context of Mali, we've seen in a number of these communities, militant Islamist groups intervene, and they do so in a sort of political way to try and manipulate the socioeconomic dynamics between the communities. Right? So they're co-opting the situation. They're trying to take advantage of it, and they do so by saying, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to offer, some form of justice for how to handle these disputes." And in general, those disputes are handled in preference to one community or the other. And then eventually they break down. But the militant Islamist groups have been able to do that more effectively in communities that have been abandoned by the state in ways that allow them to then exploit the situation for themselves, to drive recruitment, to generate revenues. And so they find sort of the socioeconomic gaps, if you want, and then they insert themselves in there to exploit the different grievances that communities already have. And so again, what we're getting at is a lack of state presence. So it's just like on the security front, armed forces need to be better than the militant Islamist groups in order to start winning. They also need to be present in terms of governance in these communities in order to start gaining trust again within those communities. And until they do that, they're going to be political drivers, socioeconomic drivers, perhaps ideological drivers that all propagate increased violent extremism and violence in the region.
The topic keeps coming up, and at its essence, I think it's about good governance. And I'd like to ask you all to comment on governance, because as you say, a lot of this instability arose out of the Arab Spring when governments were falling. So there was instability, but can you look at a model government in the region that's doing it right? And again, that gets to your issue of you have to have a regional approach. So if you've got a well-governed government in one place and next door to it is a badly governed state, what do? So I comment on this, or authoritarianism versus democracy, or something in between. Stephen?
Sure. So I'm going to emphasize probably a point of disciplinary difference between myself and the other panelists, and that I'm a geographer. And so I want to think about not just what the state is, but how it functions, where it functions. And the issue of Borderlands is something that I mentioned early. And this is traditionally, you could think of this as the hinterlands of the state, this model of where a functioning state has a core to it and it has a periphery to it, and things work slightly different on the edges than it does at the core. And in terms of a post-colonial condition, we see a great deal of divestment or lack of investment or lack of initiative or effort by states to manage all of their territory, or to try to build an entirely territorially based, geographically coherent polity. Instead, you have the issue of ethnic patronage and these types of dynamics that are present throughout the region, which means that borderlands tend to be sites of disinvestment or disinterest by the central government, historically speaking, in a very broad context. So that is where I think the issue lies, is that governments in the region should look to their peripheries or to their hinterlands as ways to build paths forward, because this is where the violence is clustered. This is where the violence is concentrated. This is where the spaces, quite literally, geographically speaking, exist for extremist groups, whether they're jihadi or something else, to recruit, to organize, and to disrupt the things that are important to everyone's daily life in the region. And so borderlands, to me, are a really key place for us to start a conversation like that. And again, that's not a conversation about which policy to have or which institution to reform. It's a way to think geographically about how to deal with this problem.
Interesting. Daniel or Emily?
I'd love to jump in to talk about democracy and security. I think that there's a tendency often to conclude that jihadist threats in Mali or Burkina Faso show that there's a trade-off between democratization and security, right? In both cases, we had burgeoning democracies, and in both cases, you have violence that disrupt that, and then instability. But I think that the empirical record shows that democracy and security go hand in hand, and that's true on the African continent as it is throughout much of the world. So eight African countries face violent extremist insurgencies. Only half of those were democratizers and half were authoritarian. So there you go. It's even. Meanwhile, 3/4 of African countries facing armed conflict, 12 out of 16, have either autocratic or semi-authoritarian governments. And so by and large, democracies are doing far better when it comes to dealing with security. 7 out of 9 autocracies facing armed conflict have leaders that have come to power via coup or prolonged their time in office by evading term limits. So this key provision of sort of democratic stability, if it's evaded, you're more likely to have armed conflict erupt. 8 out of 10 countries of origin for Africa's record levels of forced displacement are autocratic or semi-authoritarian. And so contexts that are less democratic tend to have more forcibly displaced populations. Overall, 9 of Africa's 16 autocracies, or just over half, are experiencing armed conflict. And so if you just look at the record, you can see, I think, broadly speaking, that there is a democracy advantage when we're talking about security. And one could pick any number of different examples on the conflict on the continent. We could look at Chad to see how authoritarianism has really just put a sort of cap on the pressure cooker of instability rather than actually address the security concerns of citizens. And that's exactly what democratic institutions are built to do. They're built to provide voice for citizens to express their interests so that the policymakers can then address those interests. And what we've seen in Mali and Burkina Faso, unfortunately, in the last several years, is a breakdown of that process and a return to military government, which I do not believe will pan out for the positive in terms of security. I don't think we've seen any indications so far under these military juntas that they are somehow capable of addressing the threats that they face any more so than they did under the leadership of a democratic government. And so I think that you have to have a return to democratic government in order for those policymakers to be empowered to take the steps necessary to guide the armed forces into improving the security situation.
Thank you.
And I'll just add briefly to emphasize how important the rule of law is in these contexts. And oftentimes it's a rule of law breakdown that is the space that jihadist groups are able to exploit to establish themselves. So one of the value adds that these groups provide is dispute resolution. Sometimes they're providing security too, but the way that, say, jihadist groups have expanded into central Mali is in part by providing a forum for disputes, including on land use or water use, that can be seen as less corrupt than what other options were available. Another case is where there are kind of other local armed groups that protect one part of the population, but not the other. And then you see jihadist groups come in and kind of fill that gap. And then they tend to make things worse, but they still are positioning themselves as solving a problem. And that problem is going to remain there, particularly in a case where you do not have a rule of law culture. And the other piece that I also see as a key driver is security force abuses against population coming from the state. And so if you have a context where there's not accountability for the military leadership and that runs through the whole system, then you're not going to have the kind of resolution of some of those cases that will lead to the population putting more trust in the military. So I agree with what's been said already, but I think some of the issues that you see at the top when you have this autocratic dynamic can filter through and reinforce some of the problems that are causing or reinforcing the security crisis that the regime's using to justify itself.
A couple more questions. I'm going to pair them because we're coming near the end. What are the primary financing sources for these insurgencies, and how have these sources changed over time? As well as another question on what effect does illicit trafficking have on the violence occurring near the borders? What role does this trafficking play with regards to the proliferation of extremist groups? And I add that as a possible financial source. Who'd like to take a stab at that?
I can say a few things briefly.
Great.
So one point is that for the jihadist groups in this region, kidnapping for ransom has been a big moneymaker over time. It's also had a kind of depressing effect on people from further away actually going to the region. So I'd say some opportunities for kidnapping have come down over time. So that's part of it. But the question really gets after the illicit networks, the smuggling, the trafficking that run through West Africa. And that is something that extremist groups do profit from. They aren't the main people running them necessarily. So I don't want to conflate all illicit activity with extremist groups, but they do benefit from that. And one last piece is that on the borders with, say, Burkina Faso and then the Gulf of Guinea states to the south, the national park areas on the borders across multiple states have, in several cases, become kind of key areas for jihadist groups and other criminal organizations that are profiting from routes that run through them. So that's a specific case that's worth flagging because it's become a big deal for those littoral states.
Thank you. Stephen or Daniel, anything to add to that?
I'm going to pass on that one. That one would be a little bit outside of my area of expertise.
Okay.
I'll just add that I know one area of concern is the role of artisanal gold mining in the region. There's been debate over how much of a financing mechanism artisanal gold mining provides. So artisanal gold mining sort of being informal, small gold panning operations. But also, large mines in which you have basically civilians using mining techniques to get deeper and deeper into the ground. Anyway, all of it to say that's very informal. And so in some contexts, we've seen that militant Islamist groups have exerted their presence over these mines to try and extract sort of a tax or to coerce them into paying tribute. To go back to Burkina Faso, an example I keep bringing up, I think it was about a year ago, there was a large massacre on a gold mining operation in Solhan, which is close to the border with Niger. The authorities at the time ended up shuttering all gold operations that they could in response because they discovered that mining sites that had been paying were not being targeted. And so it was an effort to try and put an end to some of the financing for militant Islamist groups in that region. It's incredibly complicated to try and determine whether that financing is going to a militant Islamist group or to just a criminal gang or what form of coercion is taking place. And so that's why there remains some debate as to how much of a financing mechanism this is.
Thank you. I regret that our time has come to an end. And so I'd like to thank our panelists and Ambassador Ray. It was a terrific discussion, but the fact that we have lots of unanswered questions in our Q&A box means I think we have to have a reprise of this. Because there's still lots to talk about. So thank you to you all. Thank you, Ambassador Ray, and thank you to our audience today. And you'll find to our audience, there's a feedback form. We read your feedback and we appreciate it. So please do fill out those forms. Thank you and have a great day.